Orders of the day.
Ballot item number 5, Order M9, second reading of Bill 9, an act to proclaim an awareness day for post-traumatic stress disorder. Mr. Bouma.
I'm going to ask all the members one last time nicely to come to order. If I have to do it again, I will start with warnings. Thank you. Member for Brantford-Brant.
Thank you, Speaker. I move second reading of Bill 9, an act to proclaim an awareness day for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mr. Bouma has moved second reading of Bill 9, an act to proclaim an awareness day for post-traumatic stress disorder. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for his presentation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It gives me great pleasure and the opportunity to change the subject to present a bill entitled An Act to Proclaim an Awareness Day for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, or PTSD, as most people call it. With this bill, we hope to set aside June 27th as PTSD Awareness Day. The first Awareness Day was created in the U.S. in 2010. However, in Canada, only Alberta has an Awareness Day. We hear the initials PTSD a lot these days. We hear it used to describe problems facing the men and women in our armed services when they return from the battlefield. We hear it used to describe the experiences of victims of spousal abuse or playground bullies. PTSD affects those who have been hurt in tragic accidents or other traumatic events. In war, PTSD has been called many things: shell shock, war neurosis, or combat fatigue. During the Second World War, air crews who refused to fly were accused of lacking moral fibre. It was common to think of people suffering from PTSD as malingerers or cowards. They were told to man up or just deal with it. We have come a long way, but unfortunately, there are still tinges of that old way of thinking in our society today. We tend to think of PTSD in connection with members of the military or first responders. And that's true, that on a day-to-day basis, because of the nature of what they do, they are most apt to come face-to-face with the types of trauma that lead to PTSD. But it can also strike randomly and indiscriminately. The tendrils of PTSD can reach deep into families, deep into neighbourhoods, and deep into communities. Just think about the recent Yonge Street or the Danforth Avenue attacks. In those two events, a dozen people died and several dozen were wounded. In many cases, we have seen their faces, we have learned their names, and we have heard their stories. The families of the slain are dealing with an immeasurable loss. The wounded and their families will live with the physical and mental scars for the rest of their lives. But the impact of those two events doesn't end there. What are the witnesses? What are the bystanders who watch these horrific acts unfold? They may have been busily rushing down the street to a business meeting where the van attack occurred. Or they might have been just another diner in a Danforth restaurant when the shooter did his worst. We don't know their names. We don't know their stories. But they may have been scarred just as deeply, just the same. How will they feel the next time they walk down that street or step inside a favourite eatery? What about the dispatchers who take these calls, who listen to the terror on our streets? They may not be able to describe the anxiety and the deep emotions that they're feeling. They may not be able to put a label on it. They just know that their lives have changed forever. Some will find a way to cope, either on their own or with the support of friends and family, but others will not. And they need to know it's not their fault. More importantly, they need to know that they are not alone and that help is available. And that's what a PTSD Awareness Day is all about. It's about helping more people to know about this illness, to recognize it and to learn how to get help. There's another group of people who could benefit from greater public awareness of PTSD. These are the victims of spousal abuse. In many cases, these people have lived with violence for years. They may have had moments when they feared for their own lives or for even the lives of their children. The stress imposed by a violent spouse can sometimes lead them to become violent themselves, turning on those around them. It's a cycle of violence that can be passed on from one generation to the next. One study found that women who take refuge in shelters are at a much higher risk of developing PTSD. Victims of domestic violence already suffer from self-doubt. They blame themselves instead of their abuser. They need to know that PTSD they suffer is not their fault either. And society needs to recognize that even long after the physical signs of abuse have healed, the mental and the emotional wounds still need to be dealt with. I want to talk a bit about my own experiences as a first responder. I've been touched by PTSD myself, and so have some of my colleagues. I make my living as an optometrist, but for 10 years I've also been a volunteer firefighter with the County of Brant. These days, a volunteer firefighter goes through the same training as a full-time firefighter, and we have to respond to all the same types of calls as our full-time colleagues. That means we respond to house fires and traffic accidents, and sometimes we're first on the scene at a medical emergency, or even, sadly, sometimes a suicide. You can be confronted by some pretty horrific scenes. Imagine the feeling of pulling a teen out of a car after he's wrapped it around a tree, or looking into the face of a senior as they take their last breath, or doing CPR on a newborn who has vital signs absent. The baby lived, I'm happy to say. Those images will never go away. There are times when I'm conducting an eye exam when I'm suddenly staring into the face of someone whose death I've witnessed. Sometimes it's hard to have a conversation with a child without these thoughts coming back to you. It's distracting. You can't get it out of your head. Unfortunately, I haven't suffered any permanent damage to my family or my career. But for others, I know it can impact your productivity, your relationships, the way you function on a day-to-day basis. If you wait until the wheels fall off, you could lose your job, your home, your spouse. All of us want to think of our first responders as tough and resilient, always ready to answer the bell, calling them to service. And they are all of that. But they're also human. Fortunately, in the Brant Fire Service, no one is afraid to say, that was a tough one. And we know that our chief, our deputy chief, and our captains are ready to talk about it. And we are also grateful that in 2016, this House passed the Supporting Ontario's First Responders Act. It assumes that when a first responder suffers from PTSD, that it is a work-related illness. And this allows faster access to treatment and benefits. It was a tremendous step in reducing the impact that PTSD has on people. But the stigma of PTSD remains. Too many people still consider PTSD a personal weakness that must be overcome, rather than a terrible and common consequence of traumatic experiences. In fact, Ontario has one of the highest rates of PTSD sufferers in the world. It's been estimated that 1 in 10 of our fellow Ontarians have been affected by it. And just to emphasize a point that I made before, we're not just talking about our veterans and our first responders. We're talking about people all around us who we meet every day. They may have been victims of violence in their own home or on the street. They may have seen a tragedy unfold or lived through a life-changing experience. Surviving a near-fatal illness can trigger PTSD. What they need is our support and a helping hand. And that's what I hope to do with this bill, which will designate June 27th as PTSD Awareness Day. It's my hope that we can decrease the stigma and help everyone realize that PTSD is a normal response to extreme stress and that there is help for those who suffer from it. Before I conclude, I want to share just one more personal experience. My family immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands when I was a child. For years, I heard my father talking about when he was a boy at the end of the Second World War, when the victorious Canadian soldiers gave him a ride on one of their tanks. Our parents raised us to always say thank you to those who had sacrificed so much for our freedom. Years later, when I was living in Michigan, I was in a parking lot when I noticed the license plate of the car in front of mine. It had a tag reading World War II veteran. When the driver stepped out of the car, I went up to him and said, "Thank you." He was confused at first. When I explained that I'd noticed the license plate and I just wanted to thank him for his service, he burst into tears. Sobbing, he said, "It's been 70 years, and that's the first time anyone has ever said that to me." So in a way, this bill is another way of me to say thank you to our veterans and first responders. And to all the victims of PTSD, we're saying, we know what you're going through, and there's help for you. I know that marking a special day on the calendar isn't enough. There's more to do, but I hope that it will be seen as another step in the right direction as we bring PTSD out of the darkness and provide some light to those who suffer from it. Thank you.